my wife's own brother, whispered in a secret childhood language that the pills hidden in her vitamins were finally working, never knowing I understood every word. The beer sweated in my hand and I nearly dropped it. Tino leaned toward Clara at the far end of the table, close enough that their foreheads almost touched, and said something in a language I wasn't supposed to know. 6 words. A whisper wrapped in a smile. They're finally working, I can tell. I kept my face loose. Bored husband on a cruise, half a beer in, watching the horizon instead of his in-laws. That's what I wanted him to see. Inside, something in my chest had gone very still, the way a room goes still right before a storm hits a coastline. Olivia was beside me, laughing at something her mother had said, reaching across the table for her water glass, and, next to it, the little amber bottle of prenatal vitamins she carried in her purse everywhere now. She'd been carrying that bottle for 4 months, since the 6th loss. Since the doctor in Denver had looked at her chart and said the word unexplained, like it was supposed to be comforting. Clara laughed, soft and satisfied, and answered him in the same language. Your plan worked. I'm not settling for 600,000. Not when there's 4 million. I understood every syllable. Olivia had taught me that language 9 years ago, in the front seat of her Honda, outside a Waffle House in Macon, Georgia, laughing so hard she cried, making me repeat words for her grandmother's rice pudding and her childhood dog. It was a private thing between the two of us for years. Then the miscarriages started, and something in her that used to reach for that language just stopped reaching. She hadn't spoken a word of it in over 2 years. She probably assumed I'd forgotten most of it too. I hadn't forgotten a word. Olivia's hand closed around the vitamin bottle. She twisted the cap. I don't remember deciding to move. I remember my elbow catching the edge of the table, my glass tipping, orange juice and champagne fanning out across the white tablecloth in a wave that knocked over the bread basket and sent Olivia's mother, Renata, half out of her chair with a gasp. The vitamin bottle rolled off the table and under a nearby cart before Olivia could open it. Sorry, I said, already laughing at myself, already playing the part. Sorry. I'm apparently one mimosa past my limit. Olivia swatted my arm, annoyed and amused in the way of someone who'd been married to a clumsy man for 9 years and had made her peace with it. A waiter swept in with towels. The moment passed the way spilled drinks always do on a cruise ship. Noisy, forgettable, gone in 90 seconds. Except I saw Tino's eyes track the bottle as it rolled under the cart. I saw him glance at Clara. I saw the flicker of irritation cross his face before he smoothed it back into the easy, golden retriever grin he wore for every camera and every relative at every family gathering since he was 19 years old. I picked up the vitamin bottle myself, dried it off with a napkin, and handed it back to my wife. Thanks, babe, she said, and slipped it into her purse without opening it. I smiled at her. Then I looked past her, at her brother, and for the first time in 9 years of marriage, I understood something about my family that I wish to God I didn't. I'm going to back up now, because you need to understand the shape of my family before you understand how close I came to losing my wife to her own blood. I'm 34. Olivia is 32. We met at a mutual friend's engagement party in Charlotte 11 years ago, when I was 23 and broke and working 2 jobs to finish a business degree, and she was a 21-year-old nursing student who laughed at my terrible jokes because, she told me later, nobody else in the room was even trying to be funny. We married 4 years after that, on a Saturday in October, in her parents' backyard in Asheville, North Carolina. Under string lights her father had spent 3 weekends hanging. Olivia's family has money. Not new money, not flashy money. The quiet, old, real estate and mineral rights kind of money that goes back 3 generations to her great-grandfather, a man named Halvard Meunier who bought up half of a small mountain town in the 1950s before anyone knew there'd be a ski resort built on it. That fortune passed down through Olivia's grandfather, Anton Meunier, who by the time I met the family was 81 years old, sharp as a blade, and worth just north of $11 million. Tino is Olivia's younger brother, 29 now, 26 when I first really started paying attention to him. He was the golden child in the way that youngest sons in wealthy families sometimes are. Handsome, charming, perpetually one business venture away from either genius or ruin. He'd started 3 companies by the time he was 28. A juice bar franchise that folded after 14 months. A men's grooming subscription box that burned through $200,000 of seed money, most of it from Grandpa Anton, before it collapsed. Most recently, a cryptocurrency consulting firm that, as far as I could tell, consisted of Tino posting shirtless gym photos captioned with stock market quotes. Every single venture had been funded, in part or in full, by Anton, and every single time, Anton had written it off with the same weary affection. The boy has spirit, he'd say, refilling his scotch at Thanksgiving. Spirit's worth something, even when the spreadsheet says it isn't. Olivia used to defend her brother to me in the early years. He's not bad, she told me once back in 2019, after Tino asked to borrow $8,000 from us directly, money we didn't have, money that would have wiped out our savings account, for what he called a can't-miss real estate flip in Charleston. We said no. He didn't speak to Olivia for 6 weeks after that. When he finally called her again, it was to ask if she could talk to their grandfather about co-signing something else. That's the pattern I want you to hold on to, because it matters later. Tino didn't handle rejection. He handled being told no by escalating, by testing a different angle, by finding whoever in the family had the softest heart and applying pressure there instead. And the softest heart in that family, without question, was Olivia's. She was the one who drove 2 hours to bail him out of a DUI stop that never actually became an arrest in the spring of 2020 because their parents were traveling and Tino called her crying at 2 in the morning. She was the one who quietly paid off a $4,000 credit card balance for him in 2021 and asked me not to mention it because he's going through a lot right now. She was the one who, every single year at Thanksgiving, found a way to excuse whatever he'd done that year. The drunk toast, the borrowed money never repaid, the way he talked over their mother at the table like her opinions were background noise. I want to be honest about my own blind spot here too, because this story isn't one where I get to stand outside of it looking heroic. I saw the pattern. I saw it for years. And I told myself it wasn't my business because Olivia's family, Olivia's money, Olivia's brother, it felt like territory I wasn't fully allowed to weigh in on, even as her husband. I regret that now more than almost anything else in this story. There's one incident from early on that I didn't understand the weight of until much later. The incident that, looking back, was the first real warning sign, the one that reads now like a lit fuse nobody noticed burning. It was Christmas of 2021. Anton had just turned 83, and over dinner, half joking, half serious in the way old men get when they've had 2 glasses of wine, he announced that he'd been tidying up the will. He said it lightly, the way you'd mention cleaning out a garage, but then he added something that made the whole table go quiet for half a second. "I've put in a clause," he said, looking mostly at Tino when he said it, "about grandchildren, about family growing, not just family taking." He laughed, tapped his glass. "An old man likes to know his money's going somewhere that'll still be standing in 50 years. Tino laughed along with everyone else, but I remember watching his face for just a second too long, the way his jaw tightened before the smile caught up to it. At the time, I read it as embarrassment, a 26-year-old with no children and no prospects, hearing his inheritance quietly tied to a future he hadn't built yet. I didn't think anything else of it. Olivia and I were already trying for a baby by then, already excited, already dreaming, with absolutely no idea what that clause would eventually cost her. We found out later, from the lawyer, exactly what Anton had written. If, at the time of his death, Olivia had a living child or was pregnant, she would inherit 60% of his estate outright. If she didn't, the estate split differently. Tino would receive a larger share, close to $4 million on its own, with the rest divided among cousins and a handful of local charities Anton favored. Olivia had a living, breathing, deeply personal reason to want a baby that had nothing to do with any will. But somewhere in the back of Tino's mind, apparently, that Christmas toast had planted a different kind of hope. Every year that passed without Olivia carrying a pregnancy to term wasn't just heartbreak for his sister. It was $4 million, slowly, agonizingly, becoming his instead. I didn't know that yet, standing at that Christmas table in 2021. I just remember the strange, cold flicker in Tino's eyes, and how quickly I let myself forget it. The miscarriages started in March of 2022. The first one was early, 7 weeks, and the doctor told us it was common, that a huge percentage of first pregnancies end this way, that we shouldn't read too much into it. We grieved quietly and tried again in June. That one made it to 11 weeks before the bleeding started on a Tuesday morning while I was at work. Olivia called me from the bathroom floor of our house, and I drove home so fast I got a speeding ticket I never told her about. Tino showed up 2 days later with a bouquet of grocery store flowers and sat with her for an hour, and I remember being grateful to him, genuinely grateful, the way you're grateful to anyone who shows up for the person you love when they're in pain. He held her hand and told her it would happen when it was supposed to happen. He seemed in that moment like a good brother. The third loss was in October of 2022 at 9 weeks. The fourth was in February of 2023 at 6 weeks. By then, Olivia had started seeing a specialist, Dr. Anwen Reyes, a reproductive endocrinologist 2 hours away in Charlotte, and had been through every test the field could offer: chromosomal panels, thyroid panels, clotting disorder screenings, uterine imaging. Every single result came back normal. Unexplained recurrent pregnancy loss, Dr. Reyes finally told us, in a small beige office in April of 2023, happens to roughly 1 to 2% of couples trying to conceive. It's one of the cruelest phrases in medicine because it tells you nothing except that we don't have an answer. Tino was there for that appointment too, waiting in the parking lot with their mother, Renata, because Olivia had asked for family support that day. When we came out, he hugged her so hard she laughed despite herself. "We're going to figure this out," he told her. "Whatever you need, I'm here." I want to be clear about something. For most of this story, I don't think Tino was lying when he said things like that. I think, in a strange way, he meant it, the way a person can mean 2 contradictory things at once if they never have to look at them side by side. He loved his sister. He also, somewhere underneath that love, had started keeping score. The fifth loss, in August of 2023, was the hardest. Olivia was 14 weeks along, past the point doctors usually consider safe, far enough that we'd told a handful of people, far enough that she'd bought one small item, a pair of yellow socks with little embroidered ducks, that she kept in her nightstand drawer afterward, because she couldn't bring herself to return them or throw them away. She went into premature labor on a Sunday night. I held her hand in a hospital in Asheville while a doctor half my age told us gently that there was nothing anyone could have done. That was the night Olivia stood on our back balcony at 2 in the morning in October air cold enough to see her breath and screamed at the sky that her body was a graveyard. I remember standing behind her, not knowing whether to hold her or give her space, terrified of both options. Tino drove over at 3 in the morning when I called him, because I didn't know who who else to call. And I will never forget how he talked her down off that balcony railing she wasn't going to jump from, but was gripping like she wanted to fall. He sat with her until sunrise. He spoke to her partly in English and partly in that old childhood language, the one their grandmother had taught them both before she passed. Soft words I didn't understand at the time. And Olivia's shoulders slowly came down from around her ears. He saved me that night, she told me later. I don't know what I would have done without him. I believed her. I still believe that night was real. That's what makes everything after it so hard to hold in my hands at the same time. The sixth loss was in January of 2024, at 8 weeks. By then, Olivia had stopped announcing pregnancies to anyone but me, and eventually her brother. She trusted him with the earliest, most fragile news, before we even told her parents, because he'd been the one who talked her off that balcony. I didn't love that arrangement, if I'm honest. Something about it sat wrong with me, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. I told myself I was being petty, competitive with my own brother-in-law over who my wife confided in first. I let it go. The seventh loss was in May of 2024, 9 weeks. By then, Olivia had developed a ritual. She took her prenatal vitamins every single night, whether she was actively pregnant or not, because Dr. Reyes had told her it was good practice for whenever the next pregnancy came to have her body as prepared as it could be. That amber bottle became a fixture on her nightstand. A small act of hope, repeated every night, no matter how many times hope had failed her. It was somewhere around that seventh loss that I noticed something strange, though I didn't understand it yet. And it's the detail I need you to hold on to for later, because it becomes the whole spine of this story. Olivia mentioned, almost in passing, that Tino had started buying her vitamins for her. He said it's the least he can do, she told me one evening in June of 2024, holding up a fresh amber bottle with a pharmacy sticker I didn't recognize. He picked these up from some specialty place near his office, supposed to be better absorption or something. I remember thinking it was sweet. I remember thinking, even then, some small ugly thought scratching at the back of my mind that I didn't want to look at directly. Why would a 28-year-old man who couldn't hold down a business for longer than 14 months suddenly develop this level of attentiveness to his sister's prenatal supplement brand? I didn't say anything. Olivia was happy. She felt cared for. I told myself that was enough of a reason to keep my mouth shut. By July of 2024, we found out we were pregnant an 8th time. We hadn't told anyone, not her parents, not mine, not even Tino yet, because after 7 losses, Olivia had adopted a rule, 12 weeks of silence, no matter how hard it was to keep. We were 4 weeks along when Renata mentioned, out of nowhere, that Anton's health had taken a turn, and that the family lawyer wanted to schedule a formal reading of updated estate documents for early September, just to make sure everything's buttoned up while Dad's still sharp enough to walk everyone through it himself. 4 weeks. That gave Tino exactly 1 month to know, one way or another, whether his sister would walk into that reading pregnant or not. That's when Renata suggested the cruise. It was supposed to be a celebration for Anton's 85th birthday, 7 days on a ship called the Meridian Star, departing from Port Everglades, the whole extended family taking over a block of cabins on Deck 9. Anton would preside from a corner suite with a private balcony, holding court the way he always did. And everyone else, Olivia and me, Tino and Clara, Renata and Marcus, 2 of Olivia's cousins and their spouses, would spend a week eating too much and pretending the family was simpler than it was. Olivia didn't want to go, not 4 weeks pregnant and terrified of another loss, but Anton had specifically asked for her, and turning down an 85-year-old man's birthday request felt cruel in a way neither of us could justify. We packed our bags in late July and told ourselves we'd keep things low-key. No alcohol for her, early nights. We'd tell the family about the pregnancy once we hit 12 weeks, sometime mid-cruise if the timing lined up, or after we got home if it didn't. I want to walk you through the week itself now, because it unfolded in a series of moments that each felt, at the time, like the worst it could get. And each time, I was wrong. The first moment came on day 2, at the welcome dinner. Tino stood up with a glass of champagne, toasted his grandfather, and then pivoted, unprompted, into a speech about new beginnings for this whole family, looking directly at Olivia while he said it. It read, to everyone else at the table, like brotherly warmth. To me, watching his eyes flick toward her stomach and then away, it read like a man checking inventory. Olivia squeezed my hand under the table and smiled at him. I smiled too, and hated myself a little for not understanding yet why the smile felt so hard to hold. The second moment came on day 3. I overheard Tino on a phone call near the ship's rear deck, his voice pitched low but sharp, talking to someone about a $150,000 deposit on what he called a stake in the new fund, some cryptocurrency venture he'd apparently already half committed to, despite having, as far as I knew, nowhere near that kind of liquid money. It's basically locked in, he said. I've got a windfall coming, September latest. I remember standing very still by the railing, coffee going cold in my hand, doing the math I didn't want to do. September was the will reading. The third moment came on day 4, and this one Olivia saw too, so I didn't have to carry it alone. At the ship's poolside bar, drunk on 4 or 5 cocktails before noon, Tino got into an argument with a bartender over a mixed drink he claimed was made wrong. It escalated fast, Tino standing, voice rising, calling the young bartender incompetent, then pivoting into a rant, loud enough that half the pool deck turned to look, about how he was about to be worth more than this entire boat, and that people like the bartender should learn some respect while they still could. could. Security walked him back to his cabin. Clara trailed behind him, not upset, I noticed. Almost amused, filming a few seconds of it on her phone before pocketing it. He's stressed about work, Olivia said that night, defending him out of old habit, though I could hear something new and uncertain creeping into her voice. It's not like him to drink like that in the middle of the day. It's exactly like him, I almost said. I didn't. The fourth moment, the one that finally cracked something open in me, happened on day 5, the same afternoon of the spilled drinks at lunch. That morning, before the family lunch where I'd knock over the table, Olivia had woken up nauseous, gray-faced, gripping the edge of the bathroom sink. 5 weeks pregnant now. Morning sickness, real and ordinary, and under any other circumstances, something we'd have been quietly relieved about, since with the earlier losses, the sickness had sometimes meant the pregnancy was progressing normally. I stepped out into the hallway to give her privacy and nearly walked straight into Tino, standing outside our cabin door with his phone in his hand, texting. He startled when he saw me, shoved the phone in his pocket a beat too fast, and asked, with a casualness that didn't match the speed of that motion, how Olivia was feeling. Little seasick, I said, watching his face carefully now, the way you watch a poker opponent you finally started to suspect. Seasick, he repeated, and something crossed his expression that I can only describe as relief, laced with disappointment. Two emotions that don't belong together, but were somehow both there at once. Yeah, that'll happen. This water's been rough. He knocked on our door a minute later, ostensibly to check on his sister, holding a bottle of ginger ale from the Lido deck bar, just in case. Small gesture, thoughtful gesture. I thanked him and took the ginger ale and closed the door, and stood there in our tiny cabin holding a can of soda. I suddenly, inexplicably, did not want my wife to drink. That was the moment, if I'm being honest, that the first real cold thread of suspicion wound itself around my spine and refused to let go. 2 nights later was the toast at family dinner, table of 9, the whisper in the language I wasn't supposed to understand, and the beer sweating in my hand while my whole understanding of my wife's family rearranged itself in about 4 seconds. I didn't sleep that night. Olivia went to bed around 10, exhausted from the nausea, and I lay next to her in the dark, running the whole day back through my head, replaying that whisper over and over until I was sure I hadn't misheard it. There's a month left before Grandpa's will reading. If she's not pregnant by then, we split $4 million. I hadn't misheard anything. I'd learned that language too well, too long ago, in a Waffle House parking lot with a woman who trusted her brother more than almost anyone else alive. Around midnight, once Olivia's breathing had gone slow and even, I got up. I told myself I was getting water. I stood in our tiny bathroom holding her vitamin bottle under the light, turning it in my hands, and I hated myself for what I was thinking, because it felt insane. It felt like something out of a movie. It felt like an accusation I had no real proof for yet, just a whispered sentence in a language a jury would never take seriously as evidence of anything. But I thought about the specialty pharmacy sticker Tino had put on her bottle 2 months earlier. I thought about the windfall he'd bragged about on that call, the one due in September. I thought about the relief and disappointment look on his face outside our cabin door, and I thought about 7 babies we'd already lost. 7 times my wife had grieved something the rest of the world would never fully understand the weight of, and I decided that I would rather feel insane and be wrong than feel reasonable and be right too late. I found the ship's gift shop still open near the atrium, one of those overpriced boutiques selling sunscreen and seasickness bands, and tucked on a bottom shelf a small bottle of sugar-based breath mints shaped almost exactly like her prenatal capsules. Off-white, oblong, the right size. I bought them with shaking hands, feeling like a criminal, feeling like I might be about to destroy my marriage over a misunderstanding. Back in the cabin, working by the dim light of the bathroom, I emptied Olivia's vitamin bottle into a plastic bag and refilled it with the sugar pills, counting them out to match, sealing the bag with the original pills inside it, and hiding it in the lining of my suitcase. My hands did not stop shaking the entire time. If I was wrong about this, if those pills were exactly what the label said they were, I would never be able to explain to my wife why I'd secretly swapped out her prenatal vitamins in the middle of the night on a cruise ship. I decided I'd rather carry that risk alone than carry the alternative. I didn't tell her. I want to be honest about how badly that decision weighed on me and still does. After everything Tino had done for her on that balcony in October, after everything he represented to her as a source of safety in the worst nights of her life, I knew that telling her my suspicion, with nothing but an overheard whisper as proof, would either shatter her completely or make her defend him so hard she'd never speak to me again. I needed proof a jury, or at minimum her own eyes, could not argue with. I needed to watch and wait. At breakfast the next morning, Tino choked on his coffee when Olivia mentioned cheerfully that she was feeling steadier. That's great, he said, patting his chest, eyes darting toward Clara for half a second. Clara, buttering a piece of toast without looking up, muttered something under her breath in their language, low enough that only I understood it. Maybe we need to raise the dose. I kept eating my eggs. My hand was steady on the fork. Somewhere underneath the table, though, I had to press my knee hard against the leg of the chair just to keep from standing up and doing something I couldn't take back. At lunch, on the pool deck, Olivia grabbed her stomach mid-sentence and excused herself, blaming bad sushi from the night before. I watched Tino's face carefully. I watched him lean toward Clara, fist bump her under the table like two people closing a business deal, and murmur 4 words in that private language while my wife walked, doubled over, toward the nearest nearest restroom. We're going to be rich, baby. I sat there with my water glass in my hand, watching my brother-in-law celebrate what he believed was the end of his sister's pregnancy, and I understood with total clarity that whatever proof I still needed, whatever plan I still had to build, I had exactly one job left on this cruise: make sure he never found out I already knew. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description, for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The fifth step came that same afternoon, and it was the one that finally made the rest of the ship, not just me, start to see what I'd been watching all week. Tino had been drinking since the pool bar incident 4 days earlier hadn't fully stopped, if I'm honest, only paused for meals and slept off in short bursts. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, at the ship's main buffet, he was loud in the specific way drunk men get loud when they've decided the whole room exists to witness their importance. He cornered one of the buffet staff, a young woman refilling a chafing dish of shrimp, and informed her that he was about to own this whole cruise line, every ship in the fleet, and that she should enjoy her job while she still has one. When his father, Marcus, tried to steer him away, Tino shrugged him off hard enough that Marcus stumbled back a step into a dessert cart. "I signed a $150,000 membership this morning," Tino announced to the room at large, to no one in particular, to everyone. "Founding member, lifetime perks. You people have no idea who you're serving." I found out later, from Clara herself, that the membership was real. A cruise line loyalty tier he'd purchased that morning, drunk off the back of a sales pitch from an onboard concierge, using a credit line he did not have the assets to support. $150,000 gone, on the strength of a windfall that existed only in his imagination, and only if his sister's pregnancy failed on schedule. Security arrived within minutes. 2 officers in white uniforms walked him, red-faced and shouting, off the buffet floor while at least a dozen phones came up to film it, passengers at nearby tables not even bothering to hide that they were recording. I sat perfectly still through the whole thing, Olivia's hand gripping mine under the table, both of us watching her brother get escorted out of a public dining room like a stranger. "I don't understand what's happening to him," Olivia whispered, and I heard something in her voice I hadn't heard before. Not the automatic defense of prior years, but something closer to fear. I said nothing. I filed the moment away with everything else I was quietly building. The final night of the cruise was the formal dinner, white tablecloths, the whole family dressed for it. Anton at the head of the table, looking frailer than he had at the start of the week, but pleased, genuinely pleased, surrounded by 3 generations of his family in one room. Tino stood, wine glass raised, sober again after 2 days of forced calm following the buffet incident, and proposed a toast to new beginnings, he said, looking around the table, landing last and longest on Olivia. "To this family, and everything it's about to become." Olivia's face went pale mid-sip. She set down her glass, pressed a hand to her mouth, and half ran from the table toward the nearest restroom. I watched Tino's face do something I will remember for the rest of my life. A smile breaking open, unguarded, pure and ugly and relieved, the kind of smile a man wears when he thinks he's just watched several $1 million fall into his lap. He leaned toward Clara. "It's finally happening," he whispered in their language, squeezing her hand under the table. I excused myself and followed my wife. She was shaking when I found her, kneeling by the toilet in a restroom near the ship's atrium, and I held her hair back and rubbed her spine and told her it was okay, that we'd get her checked out, that everything was going to be fine, while some cold, calculating part of my brain that I did not recognize in myself was already thinking about what came next. The ship's medical center was 2 decks down. We went together. The ship's doctor, a calm older woman named Dr. Halverson, ran an ultrasound an hour later, gel cold on Olivia's stomach, the small speaker in the room filling with a sound I will never stop hearing when I close my eyes. Not 1 heartbeat, but 2, fast and overlapping, like 2 small drums finding the same rhythm a half-second apart. "Congratulations," Dr. Halverson said, smiling at the screen. "You're having twins." Olivia burst into tears, the kind that come from somewhere far too deep to name, gripping my hand so hard I lost feeling in 2 fingers. I cried too, for the first time all week, real tears, the kind I hadn't let myself have since the pill bottle and the whisper and everything since. We told the family that night, back at the table, because Olivia couldn't hold it in, and honestly, at 12 weeks now, past the point of easy silence, we didn't want to anymore. Anton wept openly, unashamed, an 85-year-old man crying into a cloth napkin at his own birthday dinner. Renata screamed with joy loud enough that 2 waiters came over to check if everything was all right. Marcus stood up and hugged his daughter so hard he lifted her off the ground. Tino's face went the color of the tablecloth. He started and stopped, and I watched him grab for the story he'd need to tell himself in that moment, the fast internal rewrite a person does when reality refuses to match the plan they've spent a month building. "That's impossible. I mean, that's amazing. Wow. Impossible," I repeated back to him, quiet enough that only he could hear it, still smiling for the table, still playing the part of the happy brother-in-law. Funny word to use. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for just a moment, I watched something flicker behind his eyes. Not guilt exactly, not yet, but the first cold understanding that maybe, somehow, someone at this table knew more than they should. I didn't confront him at the table. Burning him in front of his grieving, joyful family on the same night we just announced twins was never the plan. I wanted something better than a scene. I wanted wanted something that couldn't be talked, cried, or charmed away. Later that night, once the family had scattered back to their cabins, I found him alone on the rear deck, staring out at the black water, a drink in his hand he wasn't really drinking. I walked up beside him and said 4 words to him quietly, in the one language I was never supposed to know. "I heard everything, Tino." He turned so fast he nearly dropped his glass. I told him everything, standing on that dark rear deck with the wake churning white below us. I told him I'd heard the toast on day 3. I told him about the sugar pills, about the bag hidden in my suitcase lining, about the specialty pharmacy sticker I'd since had photographed and dated. I watched a grown man's face fall apart piece by piece as he understood, in real time, that the sister he'd claimed to love had never actually been in danger from me. She'd been in danger from him, and I was the one who'd quietly stopped it. "You don't understand," he said, and his voice cracked in a way I almost felt something for. "You don't know what it's like. Grandpa's been dangling that clause for 3 years. Everyone else in this family gets to just exist and collect. I've been trying to build something real my whole life, and every single time I get close, he pulls the rug out and gives more to whoever's popping out babies. I didn't want this to happen to her. I needed it to not happen yet. You poisoned her prenatal vitamins," I said, 3 times, based on what I could tell, maybe more. "They were never going to hurt the babies," he said, fast, too fast. The words of a man who'd clearly rehearsed this defense long before he ever needed to use it. "It's not. It's just a mild anti-implantation compound. It just makes it harder for a pregnancy to hold in the earliest weeks. It's not. Nobody was supposed to get hurt. It's not the same as." I didn't need to hear the rest. I walked away from him, back to our cabin, and I did not sleep that night either, not from doubt anymore, but from the enormous cold clarity of exactly what I needed to do next. Here is what the following 6 weeks looked like once we were home from that cruise. I didn't tell Olivia yet. I know how that sounds. I've turned it over in my head 1,000 times since, whether that was the right call, and I still don't fully know. What I knew in that moment was that if I told her with nothing but a whispered sentence and a bag of swapped pills, it would become a war between what she wanted to believe about her brother and what I was asking her to believe instead. A war she might not be emotionally able to survive 12 weeks into a twin pregnancy after 7 losses. I needed something undeniable, something that didn't require her to take my word over his. I started with the pills themselves. I had the original prenatal capsules I'd swapped out, sealed in that plastic bag since the cruise, tested at an independent lab in Charlotte, paying out of pocket, telling the lab tech only that I suspected tampering with a family member's supplements. The results came back 9 days later. The capsules contained a compound not listed on the label, a substance with documented anti-implantation properties, present in a dose consistent with intentional, repeated tampering rather than any accidental contamination. I had a physician, a friend of Dr. Reyes, willing to review the lab data independently, write and sign a formal note explaining what the substance was and what its presence meant. Time-stamped, signed, real. Next was the security footage. Cruise lines keep records, deck cameras, dining room footage, incident reports from any event involving ship security, which meant the buffet meltdown and the pool bar incident both existed on file somewhere. I contacted the cruise line's guest relations department, framed my request carefully around documenting an incident involving a family member for legal purposes, and after 2 weeks of calls and 1 very patient supervisor, received copies of both incidents along with the written security reports, each one dated and stamped by ship security the same day it happened, impossible to quietly reshape into a different story later. I photographed the vitamin bottle itself from every angle, next to the sugar pills I'd used to replace its contents, laid out on a white towel with a date-stamped newspaper beside them, the kind of documentation I'd seen once in a true crime documentary, and hoped I'd never actually need to replicate in my own kitchen. Then I hired Safira Okonjo, a certified forensic linguist and court-approved translator I found through a referral from Olivia's own hospital's legal department, a small woman with a sharp, careful voice who specialized in exactly the kind of language Olivia's grandmother had taught her grandchildren decades ago. I brought her 12 short audio recordings I'd started making the moment I understood what I was listening for, using my phone tucked in a jacket pocket during that final week of the cruise, and later 2 phone calls I'd overheard and recorded at Thanksgiving that year, when Tino, increasingly desperate, had called Clara to discuss next steps, now that the twins had ruined the original plan. Safira transcribed all 12, word for word, translated and notarized, each one time-stamped and cross-referenced against the dates of specific events: the toast, the buffet meltdown, the whispered, "We're going to be rich, baby," the later, more desperate calls about what to do now. Finally, I hired a lawyer, a sharp, unhurried man named Lucian Farrow, who specialized in estate disputes, and asked him one question before I told him anything else. Does Anton's will have any language covering intentional harm by an heir toward another heir's family? Lucian pulled the trust documents. Olivia was a co-trustee by then, given power of attorney access due to Anton's declining health, which meant Lucian could review the actual language legally, not secondhand. There it was, buried in a clause on page 14 that none of us had ever had reason to read closely. A conduct provision. If any heir is found, by evidence satisfactory to the trustee, to have engaged in conduct intended to cause harm to another beneficiary or their immediate family, that heir's distribution may be frozen or forfeited entirely at the trustee's sole discretion, regardless of any other condition elsewhere in this document. It didn't matter anymore whether Olivia was pregnant on the day of the reading. It mattered whether Tino had tried to hurt her to make sure she wasn't. I finally told Olivia everything on a Thursday evening in mid-October, in the office of our couple's therapist, Dr. Priya Nadella, because I did not trust myself to say it alone in our kitchen without either of us falling apart in a way that made the conversation about something other than the truth. Dr. Nadella had cleared her afternoon for us. I laid out every piece: the whisper, the swapped pills, the lab results, the recordings, the clause. Olivia sat completely silent through most of it, her hands very still in her lap, and I remember thinking, halfway through, that I had never seen her go that quiet in 9 years of marriage. When I finished, she didn't cry right away. She sat there, twins moving somewhere under her ribs at 16 weeks along now, and said in a voice I'd never heard from her before, low and flat and cored out, "My own brother killed 7 of my babies for money." Then she screamed. Not at me, at the room, at the air, at every year of her life she now had to reread with new eyes. Dr. Nadella stayed calm, steady, let her get through the worst of it before gently asking her to breathe. And then, once the scream had passed, Olivia turned to me with something harder in her face than grief. "You knew for 6 weeks," she said. "You knew, and you didn't tell me. I was trying to protect you and the babies until I had proof strong enough that you'd never have to choose between my word and his. That wasn't your choice to make." She was right. I've never once, since that day, tried to argue that she wasn't. She didn't speak to me for 4 days after that session. Not coldly, not cruelly, just distant, processing, staying at her parents' house while she figured out how to hold both truths at once, that I'd lied to her by omission, and that I'd also very possibly saved her life and the lives of the 2 children she was currently carrying. On the 5th day she came home. She didn't fully forgive me for a long time. I don't think either of us expected her to, right away, and I never once asked her to rush it. 2 weeks before the will reading, Clara called me directly. I hadn't given her my number. She'd gotten it, I found out later, from Tino's phone while he was in the shower, scrolling through his contacts in a panic after he'd started to understand just how much evidence might already exist against him. We met at a coffee shop off a highway exit 40 minutes from her apartment. Neutral ground, her choice. She showed up with her hands shaking around a paper cup she never drank from, and a manila folder she set on the table between us like it might explode. "I want out," she said, before I'd even sat down fully. "I'll give you everything. Texts, the leftover pills he still has at his place, all of it. I just don't want to go to prison for something that was mostly his idea." I didn't promise her anything. I told her honestly that I couldn't control what a prosecutor or a trustee decided to do with what she gave me, but that cooperation tended to matter to people who had the power to decide those things. She nodded and slid the folder across the table. Inside were screenshots going back 14 months, Tino researching anti-implantation compounds online, sourcing them through an overseas supplier under a fake name, calculating dosages, discussing with Clara, in plain English this time, exactly how much of Anton's estate they stood to gain and exactly how they planned to spend it. A boat, a house outside Nashville, a ring for Clara, ironically, funded by money he intended to inherit specifically because his sister hadn't been able to have children. There was a text from 6 weeks earlier, after the twins were confirmed, where Tino had written, "We need a new angle. The pregnancy clause failed. I need to talk to the lawyer about contesting competency before Grandpa updates anything else." He'd been planning, even after the twins, to argue his own grandfather was mentally unfit to have written the very clause that now worked against him. I handed everything to Lucian the next morning. He reviewed it with the expression I'd never seen a lawyer make before, something between professional satisfaction and genuine disgust, and told me the conduct clause case was, in his words, about as airtight as these things get. He submitted the full evidence package to Anton's appointed trustee, a former colleague of Anton's named Desmond Hale, a retired judge who'd handled the family's affairs for over a decade, 3 days before the scheduled reading, along with a formal request that the trustee review it prior to any distribution being finalized. The reading took place on a Tuesday morning in November, in Lucian's downtown Charlotte office, a room with a long walnut table and floor-to-ceiling windows that made the whole thing feel more like a courtroom than a family gathering. Anton sat at the head of the table in a wheelchair now, thinner than he'd been on the cruise, but present, aware, watching the room with the same sharp eyes he'd always had. Renata and Marcus sat together. Olivia sat beside me, 7 months pregnant by then, her hand resting on the curve of her stomach. Tino walked in 11 minutes late, in a suit I recognized as new, a watch on his wrist that cost more than my first car. Already talking to Clara in the hallway about a car he wanted to look at once this is finalized. He had no idea. None of it had reached him yet. Desmond Hale had kept the evidence review quiet, exactly as Lucian had requested, so that nothing could be walked back, buried, or explained away before the room was full and the record was official. Desmond opened the reading formally, reviewed the estate's basic structure, and then, before moving to specific distributions, read the conduct clause aloud, plainly, without drama, the way a judge reads anything. Flat, clear, undeniable. Tino barely looked up from his phone. "Pursuant to that clause," Desmond continued, "and based on evidence submitted to me over the past several days by legal counsel for one of the beneficiaries, I am formally freezing the distribution allocated to Constantino Munoz Denier. Pending full review. The room went dead silent. Tino's head came up slowly, like a man surfacing from underwater. What evidence? He said. What are you talking about? Who submitted evidence? Desmond didn't answer him directly. Instead, he nodded toward the back of the room, where a small woman in a gray cardigan had been sitting quietly the entire time, a folder in her lap, someone none of the family had thought to ask about when they walked in. Saphira stood. She opened her folder, and in a calm, clear, unhurried voice, she began reading Tino's own words back to him, in the language he'd whispered them in, translated line by line into English for the rest of the room. The toast on the cruise. The pharmacy sticker joke he'd made to Clara about quality control. The fist bump under the table. We're going to be rich, baby. The 6-week-old voicemail where he discussed, with a supplier whose name Saphira read aloud in full, exactly how to source more of the compound, in case the first batch wasn't strong enough. Renata's hand flew to her mouth. Marcus stared at his son like he was looking at a stranger who had broken into his house wearing his son's face. Anton, at the head of the table, went completely still, his jaw working, saying nothing, watching his grandson's face drain of every ounce of color as Saphira's steady voice laid out, sentence by translated sentence, exactly what he had done to his own sister. That's not, Tino started, standing so fast his chair scraped back hard against the floor. That's taken out of context. That's not, Clara, tell them that's not what it sounds like. Clara didn't say anything. She was looking down at the table, not at him. He turned toward me next, and for one long second, in front of his entire family, he understood exactly who had built the case that was ending his inheritance, his reputation, and possibly his freedom, all at once. You, he said, and I watched 8 years of careful golden boy charm collapse into something raw and ugly, and finally honest. You did this. No, I said, and I kept my voice as level as his sisters had stayed. All those nights she'd defended him at family dinners without ever knowing what he was doing to her in the dark. You did this. I just made sure everyone in this room finally got to see it. Olivia stood up slowly beside me, one hand braced on the table, 7 months pregnant, and looked at her brother across a room full of people who had loved him his entire life. 7 times, she said, and her voice didn't shake. You let me believe my own body was broken. 7 times. Tino opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time in 29 years, there was no angle left to play, no softer relative to redirect toward, no story he could tell fast enough to outrun what the room had just heard in his own voice. What happened after that reading spread through the family fast, the way these things always do once the room stops being controllable. Desmond Hale referred the full evidence package to the district attorney's office within the week, and Tino was formally charged in December with 2 counts related to tampering with a substance intended for human consumption and 1 count of attempted fraud tied to the inheritance clause itself. Clara, through her own attorney, negotiated a cooperation agreement in exchange for testimony, avoiding charges herself in return for handing over every message, every supplier contact, every detail of the plan she'd helped build, and then, in the end, helped unravel. I don't know if what she did counts as redemption. I know it counted, legally, for something. Anton amended the will one final time in January, 6 weeks before he passed away peacefully in his sleep at 85, surrounded by Renata and Marcus in his own home. He left Tino nothing. Not out of cruelty, Lucian told us later. Anton had specifically dictated a short addendum, read into the record, that said only this: I loved my grandson. I do not know how to reconcile that with what he did to his sister, so I am choosing, in the end, to protect her instead. It is the hardest choice I have made in 85 years, and I make it with a full and grieving heart. Renata and Marcus split, in a way, without ever formally divorcing. Renata stayed close to Olivia, drove up every week during the last trimester, cried more than once in our kitchen about the son she felt she'd failed somehow, though none of us could ever point to a single thing she'd actually done wrong. Marcus took longer. He didn't speak to Tino at all for the first 8 months after the reading, and when he finally did, it was a single supervised phone call arranged through Tino's defense attorney, 12 minutes long, the contents of which Marcus has never shared with either of us. Not every relative sided with Olivia immediately, which surprised me more than it should have. One of her cousins, a man named Basile, who'd grown up close to Tino, spent a full year insisting the evidence had been taken out of context, that families shouldn't destroy each other over money, that surely there was an explanation none of us were giving Tino the chance to offer. He came around eventually, in October of the following year, after sitting through part of the trial himself and hearing Saphira's testimony read aloud in a courtroom instead of a conference room. He called Olivia the night the verdict came in and apologized for over an hour. She forgave him. She's better at that than I am. The trial itself took 9 months to reach a resolution. Tino's attorney tried, at various points, to argue the recordings had been obtained improperly, that the language barrier made translation inherently unreliable, that his client had been suffering from undiagnosed financial stress that impaired his judgment. None of it held. Saphira's certifications were airtight. My own testimony, along with the independently tested lab results and the cruise line's own security footage, built a timeline the defense could poke at, but never actually break. In September, 14 months after that whisper on the cruise, Tino was convicted on all 3 counts. He received 4 years, with the possibility of parole after 2, and a restitution order tied to legal fees that will likely follow him for a decade. I won't pretend there was triumph in the courtroom that day. day. I remember watching him let out in handcuffs, 29 years old, once the kind of man who could talk his way into any room in the family, and I felt something far more complicated than victory. I felt the particular grief of watching someone you once genuinely liked become, through his own choices, someone you can never trust in a room with people you love again. Olivia gave birth to the twins in March, 7 months after the will reading. A boy and a girl, 6 pounds 2 ounces and 5 pounds 11 ounces, both healthy, both loud, both here. We named the boy Anton, after her grandfather, who never got to meet him, but who had, in his own way, made sure he'd have a chance to exist safely. We named the girl Reyes, after the doctor who spent 2 years telling us unexplained, instead of giving up on us. There were logistical nightmares tangled through all of it that nobody prepares you for, probate delays that stretched Anton's estate settlement out past the birth, a life insurance policy Tino had apparently taken out on himself years earlier that Marcus had to untangle from a beneficiary designation that still absurdly listed Olivia as secondary, a series of calls with Wells Fargo about a joint account Tino and Olivia had shared since childhood that needed to be formally split, a subpoena for Olivia's medical records that our lawyer had to fight to keep sealed from public court filings to protect her privacy through the trial. And there was grief too, real grief, not just for the pregnancies she'd lost, but for the brother she'd had before all of this, the one who'd sat with her on that balcony in October and talked her down using their grandmother's language, the one who'd shown up with grocery store flowers after the second loss. I watched her sit alone on our porch more than once during that year, not crying exactly, just still, holding something that had no good place to go. I miss who I thought he was, she told me once, twins asleep upstairs, even though I know now that person was never fully real. I didn't have anything to say to that except to sit with her until the porch light drew in enough moths that we finally went inside. Anton and Reyes are 2 years old now. Anton has his mother's laugh, loud and sudden, the kind that turns heads in restaurants. Reyes is quieter, watchful, the kind of toddler who studies a room before she decides whether to trust it. And I sometimes wonder, probably unfairly, whether some small part of her inherited that caution from everything her mother carried while pregnant with her. We moved out of the house where Olivia screamed on the balcony that October night, not because anything was wrong with the house itself, but because she wanted a fresh set of walls for this next chapter, ones that hadn't absorbed 7 different griefs before the twins ever arrived. We live 20 minutes from Renata now, close enough for Sunday dinners that no longer include an empty chair everyone tiptoes around, because eventually the family simply stopped setting a place that wouldn't be filled. Olivia went back to nursing part-time last year, pediatric oncology. Work, she says, makes her grateful in a way that's hard to explain to people who haven't lost what we lost. She doesn't talk about Tino often. When she does, it's usually brief, factual, delivered in the same measured voice she's used since that day at the will reading. He's still inside. He wrote her a letter last spring she chose not to open. His parole hearing is scheduled for next year, and she hasn't decided yet whether she'll attend. I think about that whisper on the cruise more than I probably should, given how much time has passed. I think about how close we came to losing 2 more babies to a bottle of vitamins on a nightstand, to a man who genuinely believed, somewhere in the tangled logic he'd built for himself, that he deserved that money more than his own sister's children did. I think about how easily I could have talked myself out of hearing what I heard, could have told myself I'd misunderstood a language I hadn't spoken fluently in years, could have let the moment pass the way so many small warning signs pass unspoken in every family, right up until they can't be unspoken anymore. The truth I keep landing on, the one this whole story has been building toward, is this: love and entitlement can live in the same person at the same time, without one canceling the other out. Tino loved his sister. I believe that even now, even after everything. He also believed with total sincerity that the universe owed him more than she'd been given, and that belief was strong enough to make him poison the one thing she wanted more than anything else in the world. Those two truths sat inside him simultaneously for years, and none of us, not Olivia, not their parents, not even me until that final week on the water, understood how dangerous it is to let entitlement sit quietly beside love for long enough. I don't tell this story for sympathy. Olivia and I got the ending most people in our situation never get. 2 healthy children, a family that mostly closed ranks around the truth once it finally surfaced. A legal system that, for once, moved slowly but correctly. What I want you to take from it instead is smaller and harder to package into anything triumphant. Watch the people closest to you. Not with suspicion, not with cruelty, but with honesty about what you're actually seeing instead of what you've decided, out of love or habit or family loyalty, you're willing to see. My wife's own brother whispered, in the one language he thought no one else at that table could understand, that the pills hidden in her vitamins were finally working. He never knew I understood every word. I've turned that sentence over more times than I can count in the 2 years since, and I still don't know whether the worst part was what he did, or how long the rest of us had spent training ourselves not to notice the shape of who he already was. Some nights, watching Anton and Reyes sleep in the same room I once stood in holding a stolen bottle of sugar pills with shaking hands, I let myself feel something close to peace, not triumph, something quieter than that. The particular, complicated peace of knowing exactly what almost happened, and exactly what it cost to stop it, and exactly how much of my family I still had to mourn even after I won.